But just minutes later, Crockett flipped the entire room with evidence that shook America. If this is how the powerful spend our trust, then what else are they stealing behind our backs? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The marble walls of the House Oversight Committee chamber stood silent witnesses to a political reckoning. The room, packed shoulder to shoulder with aides, reporters, and stone-faced lawmakers, crackled with anticipation as cameras blinked red, live feed rolling nationwide. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a staged war zone, and everyone knew who was about to walk into the fire. The agenda was clear: to investigate Kevin McCarthy's alleged misuse of PAC funds totaling over $250,000, funneled into private resorts, Age Bordeaux, and luxury suite tickets to Lakers games, all during a time when Americans were drowning in inflation and evictions. The irony was acidic. Jasmine Crockett, the firebrand congresswoman from Texas, had triggered this very hearing after weeks of combing through financial records buried under procedural fog. Young, black, razor-smart, and relentlessly unfiltered, she'd become a lightning rod, praised by the unheard, vilified by the powerful. And now she was moments away from confronting the man whose empire had once towered over this very chamber. But today the roles were reversed, and the crown McCarthy once wore was hanging by a thread. When he entered, it was with the swagger of a dethroned monarch still pretending the throne hadn't been pulled from beneath him. Kevin McCarthy didn't walk. He glided, flanked by loyal staffers gripping manila folders like shields. The buzz from the press pit swelled. Cameras snapped in bursts, reporters whispering into mics as if they were narrating the return of Caesar. He took his seat without looking at anyone, yet radiated the cold confidence of a man convinced this was still his arena. His suit was immaculate, his hair meticulously parted, his face unreadable. But his eyes carried defiance, not remorse. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat silent, poised, fingers resting lightly on a stack of sealed documents. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe heavy. She simply stared, as if calculating every inch of his presence. She knew the weight of the moment, not just for her, but for every voice silenced by men like him. She wasn't just here to ask questions. She was here to expose the cost of power and the men who spent other people's futures to buy it. And just as the silence began to settle across the chamber like fog before a storm, Kevin McCarthy leaned into the mic, not to answer questions, but to throw the first punch. He tapped the mic once. The sound echoed, sharp and intentional. Then he looked out across the room, calm, composed, and ready to strike. This committee, or he began, voice steady and rehearsed, was meant to hold people accountable, not to help someone build their personal brand. He didn't name Jasmine Crockett right away. He didn't need to. Every eye in the room knew exactly who he meant. Some of us came to Congress to work, he went on, tone tightening, to write laws, to serve the public. Others came to go viral. The dig landed. There were small laughs from the Republican side, the kind meant to sting more than entertain. McCarthy leaned back slightly, smirking. "Let's not pretend this is about real oversight anymore," he added. "It's about who can get the most retweets, the best soundbite. Congresswoman Crockett isn't serving the people. She's using this place as a stage. And quite frankly, the American taxpayer deserves better than that." The room shifted. Reporters looked up from their notes. Cameras zoomed in. A few aides nodded. Others exchanged quiet glances. Jasmine sat still, her hands folded on the desk, not moving a muscle. She didn't look down. She didn't break eye contact. Her face said nothing. But her eyes said everything. They were focused, sharp, locked onto McCarthy like she was measuring the exact moment to strike. Around her, the laughter grew, polite but pointed. One conservative aide whispered, "That'll be trending in 5 minutes." Another chuckled under his breath, "She won't recover from that." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, because she wasn't here to win a moment. She was here to reveal a pattern, and she knew better than anyone. The louder they laugh at you, the more afraid they are of what you're about to say next. But McCarthy wasn't done. Not when he smelled weakness. With the press still feeding on his opening jab, he shifted gears, not to defend himself, but to drag Jasmine deeper into a narrative he had carefully prepared to control. He reached down and lifted a crisp stack of paper with the precision of a showman who knew his next move would dominate headlines. "Since transparency is the theme of the day," he said, eyes scanning the chamber, "let's take a look at the spending habits of one of our loudest members." He flipped the first page with deliberate slowness, letting the silence stretch long enough to spark tension. Then he read aloud, "Not evidence, but ammunition. A list of office expenditures pulled out of context, exaggerated in tone, and framed to sound scandalous. $6,412 on staff travel in Q2. Another $2,300 on community outreach mailers. Thousands in district meetings, none of them audited. You call that fiscal responsibility?" His voice sharpened, leaning into every syllable with the confidence of a man who had turned truth into theater. The numbers weren't illegal, weren't even unusual, but framed in the right light, they became suspicion. That was all he needed. "This is what hypocrisy looks like," he declared, turning to the cameras. "The progressive left rails against corruption while hemorrhaging taxpayer dollars with no oversight of their own." The effect was immediate. Republican lawmakers clapped like trained jurors, satisfied not by justice, but by the performance of it. A Fox News producer, seated near the wall, tapped rapidly on her phone. Within seconds, a tweet exploded onto the timeline. "Crockett spending exposed. Glass house. Meat stones." The chamber buzzed. Reporters leaned forward. Laughter, smug and rehearsed, spilled from McCarthy's side like a leak of power reclaimed. On the surface, it was working. The narrative was tilting. The room was shifting. And Jasmine, she didn't respond. Her face didn't change. She didn't even blink. But beneath her calm, the unfairness of it all pressed like a weight on every rib. She was being painted as the problem by the very man under investigation. The one who used PAC money to fund beachfront retreats and private box seats was now wagging his finger at staff coffee budgets and town hall flyers. It was a masterclass in projection, and every second of it was being televised. But Jasmine Crockett didn't interrupt, because she knew real power doesn't panic, it prepares. The chamber had turned against her, not with shouts or slurs, but with something colder. The quiet complicity of those who knew better and chose to disappear anyway. Jasmine leaned toward her mic, voice steady but edged with urgency. "Mr. Chair, I need to respond to..." Click. The microphone snapped off with surgical precision, as if someone had been waiting for that exact moment. She blinked, not in surprise but in calculation. Around her, no one stirred. The Democrats, her colleagues, her supposed allies, kept their eyes down. One adjusted his glasses, another tapped his pen. Not a single one looked her way. They weren't confused. They were afraid. Afraid of being next, afraid of McCarthy's media machine, afraid of being accused of siding with the angry black woman trope that political survival demanded they avoid. Jasmine pressed the button again, firmer this time. "I will not allow false claims." Click. Cut off once more. No ruling, no objection. Just silence. Institutional, deliberate, and unmistakably targeted. The kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone wants it that way. McCarthy seized the moment like a wolf that smelled blood in still water. He turned slightly, not even facing her fully, and let the venom slide from his tongue like it was casual truth. "Congresswoman," he said with that same smirk, the one meant to belittle without breaking a sweat, "when you've learned how real politics works, feel free to come back and speak with the grown-ups." Laughter spilled across the aisle, not loud but cruel, condescending, controlled, the kind of laugh that carries history behind it. Jasmine's jaw locked, but she didn't speak, because she knew that if she did, they'd turn her tone into the story. They'd weaponize her volume, not her facts. What made it worse wasn't just the insult, it was the silence that followed. The silence of Democrats who knew the truth, who had read the same reports, who knew this hearing had started because of her work. And still, they said nothing. It wasn't just isolating, it was betrayal, designed, precise. And yet Jasmine didn't crumble. She didn't fold. because some people walk into rooms to be accepted. She walked into this one to be remembered. She had taken the insults, absorbed the silence, watched her own party look away, and yet Jasmine Crockett didn't crack. She recalibrated, and when she finally moved, it wasn't to defend herself. It was to detonate something no one in that room saw coming. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, brushing past the untouched notepad on her desk and reaching beneath the table. She didn't rush, didn't speak, didn't even glance at the man who had just tried to humiliate her in front of a nation. Instead, she pulled out a black folder, thick, crisp-edged, and sealed with a security clasp that clicked open like the cocking of a gun. Across the front, in red block letters, it read, "PAC Disbursement, Rancho Palos Verdes, Confidential." The room tensed. A camera on her left zoomed in, catching the words with crystal clarity. Screens lit up in the press gallery. Reporters sat up straighter. For the first time in the entire hearing, the silence wasn't meant to silence her. It was anticipation. She placed the folder on the table, perfectly centered, and tapped the cover once. Not hard, not loud, but with purpose. Then she looked up, her voice soft but unshakable, and said, "I only have a few questions and a few disbursement records." It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a warning. No raised voice, no fiery speech. Just 10 words in a classified file that carried more weight than every insult McCarthy had hurled combined. The power dynamic in the room shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it shifted. Her posture didn't change, but something in the air around her did. It was the quiet before the reckoning. The moment when everyone watching realized this wasn't going to end the way they thought. The folder was open. The silence was suffocating. And in the space where McCarthy had once controlled the narrative, Jasmine Crockett began dismantling it. Not with volume, but with verifiable numbers that hit harder than any insult ever could. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power, when real, doesn't announce itself. It simply takes the room. With deliberate calm, Jasmine Crockett lifted the first page from the folder, its glossy finish reflecting the overhead lights like the surface of a blade. Her fingers were steady, her face composed, but her eyes burned with precision. "Let the record reflect," she began, sliding the document onto the desk where the cameras could see it, "that former Speaker Kevin McCarthy authorized $42,100 in PAC funds for a 6-night stay at Terranea Resort, Rancho Palos Verdes. Oceanfront suite, private chef, spa services." A collective breath caught in the room, not gasps, not yet, but something worse, that creeping shift in temperature when truth starts slicing through illusion. She flipped the page. On June 14, $11,200 was billed to a Napa Valley wine retailer. 6 bottles of Chateau Margaux, 2000 vintage, shipped directly to a non-listed residential address. Murmurs rippled across the benches. Laptops clicked open. Phones were already recording. Crockett didn't glance up. Her focus was surgical, her tone clinical. She wasn't prosecuting. She was dissecting. On July 3rd, another $34,000 was processed for what the disbursement form calls strategic outreach. She paused, turned to face McCarthy. "The attached invoice is for a VIP suite at the Lakers-Celtics game. Private entrance, bottle service, parking for 3. McCarthy's lips twitched, but the smile never fully formed. His jaw clenched instead. His fingers, once folded confidently on the table, began to twitch against his palm. The laughter that had filled the room earlier had gone still. It was replaced with the rhythmic tapping of reporters typing as fast as they could, and the nearly imperceptible hum of broadcast equipment shifting focus from him to her. She pulled out another document, this one color-coded, every line item matched to a PAC debit, each time-stamped, categorized, and cross-verified. "In total," she said, tapping the top of the summary page, $258,400 in unexplained expenditures. Then slower, all filed under terms like wellness consulting, outreach engagement, and, my personal favorite, relational development. There was no sarcasm in her voice, Just clarity. Just truth. Sharpened to a point and placed directly under the spotlight. McCarthy let out a short laugh. Dry, defensive, the sound of a man trying to brush off a building collapse. Context matters, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But no one saved him. No one jumped in. Even the Republican side, previously so full of swagger and smirks, had gone unnervingly quiet. A few members scrolled their phones. One adjusted his tie and avoided eye contact. Jasmine took a breath, then placed a printed image in front of the committee. It was a still frame from security footage. Time-stamped the exact date of the strategic outreach invoice. It showed McCarthy exiting a private elevator at Crypto.com Arena, a PAC staffer trailing him, holding what appeared to be a gift bag and bottle. She didn't say a word. The image said enough. The projection screen behind her flicked on. The same document she had held up now appeared in high resolution for all to see. She spoke again, and this time the voice wasn't calm. It was steady in a new way, colder, tighter, as if each word carried the weight of a promise. This isn't about receipts. It's about what those receipts say, about what they imply, and about the fact that while everyday Americans were told to tighten their belts, the man who once lectured this chamber on fiscal discipline was sipping Bordeaux in a skybox on donor dollars. McCarthy tried to speak. The mic caught the start of a breath, but Crockett didn't break. "Not yet," she said without turning. "I'm not finished." Her eyes scanned the panel, locking with the chair, then sweeping across the Democratic side. Some of her colleagues finally looked up. Shame flickered in a few of their faces. She didn't need their approval. What she needed, and had just taken, was control of the room. She pulled one final sheet from the folder, slid it beneath the camera lens, and read, Line 47, August 19th, Community Outreach Meeting, $5,700, location, Soho House, Malibu, attendees, undisclosed. She let that hang for a moment. There's no record of minutes, no posted agenda, no guest list, just a line item and silence. The documents were now public, the numbers undeniable, and the oxygen in the room had thinned to a wire's edge. Jasmine Crockett leaned in, not to argue, not to retaliate, but to ask the one question that sliced through the noise like glass through silk. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence stretch, not as a pause, but as pressure. Every second another turn of the vice on a man now exposed. McCarthy sat across from her, still gripping the arms of his chair. The faint smile on his face stretched thin and hollow. She watched him for a beat longer, studying the performance unraveling behind his eyes. Then with surgical calm, she lifted the receipt again, highlighted, time-stamped, signed. The figure glared back at the room in stark black ink. $11,200. Chateau Margaux, $2,000. Her voice when it came was soft but icy. "So let me get this straight," she said, each word placed like a weight on the table. "You believe your position, your title, entitles you to 6 bottles of Bordeaux at $1,800 a pop?" The room froze. McCarthy blinked, caught between offense and uncertainty, as if he couldn't decide whether to laugh or deny. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. The cameras shifted slightly, closing in, waiting. But Jasmine wasn't finished. "Is that what public service looks like to you? Vintage French wine billed as strategic outreach, while teachers in your district beg for basic classroom supplies?" Her tone never wavered. She didn't raise her voice because truth doesn't need volume. It only needs clarity. "Do you really think the donors who trusted you with their contributions envisioned them poured into crystal decanters at luxury resorts?" Another beat. Then she added with deliberate precision, "Or is this just how power rewrites accountability, one overpriced bottle at a time?" Across the chamber, not a single Republican dared to interrupt. On the Democratic bench, heads that had once turned away now faced forward again, quiet, uncertain, but watching. McCarthy's face was flushed, his hands still, his jaw tight. He tried to chuckle, a low, brittle sound, but it died in his throat. Crockett just stared, not with anger, not even with contempt, but with the calm of someone who had done the work, lined up every fact, and now had the patience to let the weight of her questions settle like a verdict in real time. And in that moment, the question wasn't just his to answer. It belonged to the whole country. The room was holding its breath, still reeling from the sting of Crockett's Bordeaux question. But what came next wasn't commentary. It was cross-examination. And McCarthy had just found himself on the wrong side of the witness stand. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't demand attention. It seized it. Her voice, now free of any trace of hesitation, carried the clipped cadence of a seasoned prosecutor. The air had shifted. No longer a hearing, no longer political theater. This was a courtroom now, and Kevin McCarthy was the defendant. "Mr. McCarthy," she began, eyes fixed on him like crosshairs, "can you confirm for the committee who is listed as the official manager of your leadership PAC, the Committee for the American Future?" McCarthy blinked, clearly thrown by the sudden shift in tone. He hesitated, glancing toward his legal counsel, seated a few feet behind him. But Jasmine didn't wait. "Let me save you the time," she continued, flipping to a document already projected on the hearing room screen. "This is your PAC's FEC filing dated March the 17th, 2023. It lists one Christopher Bell, your personal executive assistant of 5 years, as acting treasurer and authorized disbursement officer." Her voice hardened. "Is that correct? Yes or no?" McCarthy licked his lips, clearly calculating. "That is accurate, yes," he admitted, his tone now noticeably thinner, the confidence evaporating with every syllable. Jasmine leaned forward, eyes narrowing, her tone now laced with cool incredulity. "And just to clarify, Mr. Bell has no background in accounting, federal compliance, or campaign finance law?" McCarthy stiffened. "He's a trusted member of my staff." "That's not what I asked," Crockett snapped, cutting him off like a scalpel. "Does he have formal training in financial oversight or compliance with FEC regulations?" There was no way out of this one. "No," McCarthy muttered. Jasmine nodded once, like a chess player watching a piece fall exactly where she had predicted. Then, without pause, she struck again. "And are you aware that according to internal documents obtained by this committee, over $250,000 in PAC disbursements were personally authorized by you, without any independent review, audit, or financial committee approval?" McCarthy shifted in his chair. This isn't a trick question, Mr. McCarthy," she said, her voice calm, but now lethal in its precision. "Did you personally sign off on the disbursements for the Terranea Resort, the Chateau Margaux wine order, and the Crypto.com VIP suite?" "Yes or no?" McCarthy looked around the room as if it might rescue him, but there was no lifeline, no laughter, no applause, just quiet judgment and rolling cameras. "Yes," he said finally. It wasn't a confession, it was surrender. Jasmine took a slow breath. Her tone dropped, low and cold. "Mr. McCarthy, are you aware that what you've admitted under oath today may constitute a direct violation of federal campaign finance laws prohibiting the personal use of political donations?" I believe there's room for interpretation." "That's a yes or no legal question, Mr. McCarthy," she shot back. "Are you aware that what you've admitted under oath today places you under the jurisdiction of potential campaign finance violation statutes?" McCarthy froze. The color drained slightly from his face. "Yes," he said, barely audible. Now the room stirred, not in chaos but in realization. Reporters sat straighter. Keyboards clicked with fresh fury. C-SPAN's camera panned in tight on Jasmine's face, composed and unshaken. The weight of the nation now pivoting toward her every word. She didn't stop. "I am formally requesting that this committee submit today's transcript and related financial exhibits to the FEC and the Department of Justice for independent review," she said, now turning toward the chair. "Because this committee may have begun as a platform for deflection, but it will not end as a sanctuary for corruption." A beat of silence. Then she turned back to McCarthy one final time. "You walked in here today believing your past power would shield you from present truth," she said quietly. "You weaponized procedure, condescension, and the silence of others to bury what you thought no one would dare bring to light. But today, Mr. McCarthy, under oath on the record, you answered to something even bigger than this committee." She paused. "You answered to the public. The room was dead still, and in that stillness, McCarthy, the former speaker, the self-styled tactician, the man who had once controlled every lever of House power, sat alone, no longer in control of the moment, the room, or even the story. He had become the story, and Jasmine Crockett, with nothing more than a file folder, a legal code, and her voice, had just rewritten its ending. The walls had already begun to close in. Fiscal violations, personal misuse, public embarrassment. But now Jasmine Crockett reached for the final nail, not forged in numbers, but in intent. And what she held wasn't just a receipt, it was a confession. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The energy in the room had shifted again. Less courtroom now, more like a detonation site just seconds from ignition. She reached slowly for a different folder. This one unmarked, slimmer than the financial records, but somehow heavier. There was no label, no introduction, just a quiet tension as she laid it flat and flipped it open. Her fingers moved with precision, unsealing the top document and holding it without comment, letting the cameras catch the heading. Email exchange, March 12th, 2024. Subject, Q2 Legislative Strategy and Fundraising Alignment. Then she spoke, her tone flatter now, factual, like reading evidence into a record. This is an internal communication, she began, between Kevin McCarthy and two senior members of his political staff. It was obtained through whistleblower submission from a former aide, verified by cybersecurity experts under committee protocol, and corroborated by email headers and authentication chains. McCarthy visibly tensed. His eyes darted to the screens now lighting up behind Crockett. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. The email in question reads, and I quote, "If Chevron can bump their contribution by another $50,000, I'll shelve the emissions bill for one more quarter. We can float a delay on committee referral until late summer. No one will notice." She let the words land. She didn't rush to the next sentence. She gave them space, let the oxygen twist around every syllable until it burned. Across the chamber, chairs creaked as lawmakers leaned forward. Journalists stared at the projection screen, some frozen mid-keystroke, others simply whispering, "Oh my God," into hot mics. On the far left bench, one Democratic aide dropped their pen. The gravity of it was immediate. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't inference. This was legislative barter. A direct transaction between corporate dollars and public policy. Crockett continued, now moving to the second page of the printout. Another email, dated April 2nd, 2024, reads, "Need to keep Valero warm. Remind them about the ethanol tax break. That's worth more than we're asking. Circle back post-break with PAC invoice." She looked up then, not to McCarthy, but to the committee chair. These communications suggest a pattern, not isolated incidents, not misinterpretations, a pattern of exchanging public policy outcomes, or the obstruction of them, for direct financial gain. That's not lobbying. That's trafficking legislation. McCarthy tried to speak, but no one yielded the floor. His mouth moved, but his mic stayed off, deliberately. Crockett wasn't finished. "I want to be clear," she said, now standing fully upright. Her presence, already commanding, had become immovable. "This is not about partisanship. This is about the integrity of lawmaking in the United States Congress. When a sitting member offers to stall, sabotage, or suppress legislation, not for reasoned debate, not for the public interest, but for a $50,000 check, that member is no longer serving the people. They're auctioning democracy." A low wave of murmurs rolled across the room. It wasn't noise. It was disbelief turning into realization. She turned back to the email. The bill referenced the emissions control measure known as HR 7234 was set to introduce penalties for carbon overproduction in oil and gas refining. It was expected to reduce emissions by nearly 12% over 5 years. That delay McCarthy offered in exchange for money, it meant 3 more months of unchecked pollution, thousands of additional tons of carbon into the atmosphere, and it meant nothing to him, except a line item on a spreadsheet. Now she did look at McCarthy, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with clinical detachment. Did you think this wouldn't surface? That you could reduce the democratic process to a casual transaction and the paper trail would dissolve into the air like exhaust? McCarthy stared ahead, face pale. His fingers twitched against the table, and the room caught it. Crockett moved closer to the monitor and brought up a third document. A response from McCarthy's deputy chief of staff. It read simply, "Understood. Will advise Chevron PAC team. Have invoice ready post-filing deadline." She raised her eyes again. Invoice. For legislation. Then she turned to the committee. "Mr. Chairman, I move that this document set be entered into the official record under Rule 7-14 with accompanying certification from the Cybersecurity Office. I also move that we open an immediate referral to the House Ethics Committee and the Department of Justice, as this matter may constitute not only a violation of campaign finance law, but potential bribery under Title 18, U.S. Code Section 201. The room had stopped functioning like a hearing. It was now something else. Something historic. But Crockett wasn't finished. Kevin McCarthy didn't just misuse funds. He didn't just reward himself with wine and resort views while his constituents struggled with gas prices and medical debt. He actively traded legislative influence, the very purpose of this chamber, in exchange for corporate favor, and he put it in writing. The screen went dark, and in the silence that followed, the sound of a crumbling legacy was louder than anything anyone dared to say. There are moments when silence is heavier than sound, when the absence of defense becomes the loudest admission of guilt. And just as the weight of Crockett's revelations settled over the hearing room like a storm, McCarthy broke, not with logic, not with rebuttal, but with fury. Kevin McCarthy rose to his feet like a man trying to escape gravity. His chair scraped violently across the floor, its echo ricocheting off the marble walls of the Oversight Committee room like a warning shot. The cameras zoomed in. Reporters leaned forward. The nation, through 100 live streams, leaned with them. "This is a damn setup," he roared. It wasn't the polished voice of a former speaker now, not the smug, composed authority of the man who once held the gavel over the House of Representatives. This was a raw, unvarnished outburst. Primal, cracked, trembling at the edges. A man who had built his legacy on controlling the room had just lost it in front of millions. His fist balled at his sides, jaw clenched as he spat the next words. "This entire thing, these leaks, this performance, it's a coordinated political ambush. Dirty, underhanded. This isn't justice. It's theater." Jasmine Crockett didn't move, not a twitch. She simply watched him unravel, watched him burn. Around him, even members of his own party shrank back. Senatorial suits stiffened, brows furrowed. One Republican congressman from Georgia, who had previously spent the hearing nodding in rhythmic agreement with McCarthy's interruptions, slowly stood. He said nothing. He didn't announce his departure. He simply turned, his face unreadable, and walked out of the chamber without a word. A low, hollow silence followed his exit, the kind of silence that felt like a verdict. Still, McCarthy raged. "You think this is accountability?" he barked, voice cracking. "You don't know the first thing about real governance? You're not here for truth. You're here for headlines." He jabbed a finger at Crockett. His hands were shaking now, not from anger alone, but from something deeper, panic. "You think you're a crusader," he snarled, "but you're just a camera-hungry puppet for the radical left." The room remained still. No one answered. The Republican side of the dais remained stone-faced, frozen in the uncertainty of whether to defend or distance. McCarthy's voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, but with each syllable, it lost its weight. What once commanded rooms now only filled them awkwardly. Crockett slowly shifted in her chair. Just slightly, her fingers laced together atop a manila folder, the documents inside still humming with consequence. She leaned in, barely, and locked eyes with the man now standing across from her. Not as his equal, but as his reckoner. She spoke with a calm that cut deeper than his shouting ever could. "I'm not dirty, Mr. McCarthy," she said softly, voice steady and measured. "Only your budget is." It was a moment designed not to silence, but to expose, a verbal scalpel that sliced away the shouting, leaving only the truth to bleed out. The press gallery reacted in a gasp. One NBC correspondent in the back row mouthed "wow" to no one in particular. The stenographer, who had typed through years of hearings without emotion, actually paused, fingers hovering above the keys, registering the weight of what had just been said. It was not just a mic drop, it was an unmasking. McCarthy froze, his arms still outstretched, his mouth halfway open. He didn't know how to answer. There was no speech prepared for this, no talking point, no pivot, just the weight of being called out, naked and raw, by a woman who refused to blink. Crockett leaned forward slightly more now, her voice still low, but each word heavy with precision. "Don't confuse exposure with attack," she said, eyes narrowed like a trial lawyer about to close. "No one twisted your words. No one forged those documents. The only thing that made this hearing dirty was your signature. On those checks, on that email, on the decisions you made, not for your constituents, but for your donors." McCarthy's hands slowly lowered to the table. His shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked around, scanning the room for someone, anyone, who might leap to his defense. But there were no allies rising, no outraged defenders charging in. The silence was suffocating, and Crockett wasn't done. "The difference between us," she said, her tone now surgical, "is that I came here with evidence. You came here with excuses. I spoke with documents. You shouted with desperation." She paused. The pause was deliberate. She let the moment breathe, because even silence in the right hands is a weapon. "And if you think this is political theater," she added, "maybe that's because it's the first time in years someone has forced you to play a role you can't script." The impact landed like a thunderclap in a cathedral. A Republican aide at the far end of the bench whispered something to their colleague. Even that small motion was caught by the cameras. This was no longer a hearing, it was a reckoning. McCarthy sat slowly, as if realizing for the first time that standing had only made the fall steeper. His face, once defiant, was now pale, eyes glassy. He blinked rapidly, but no tears came. Only the look of a man out of lines, out of time, and out of allies. Jasmine Crockett exhaled through her nose and gently pushed the final folder back across the table. The moment was over, but the fallout had only just begun. The shouting had stopped. The documents had been laid bare. But the most lethal weapon Crockett carried wasn't a piece of paper. It was a question, one that pierced not policy, but soul. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jasmine Crockett sat with the calm of someone who already knew the outcome. The cameras, once swiveling frantically between reactions, were now still, locked in on her face like it was the center of gravity. A stillness had seized the room, thick as smoke, after McCarthy's meltdown and the thunderous unveiling of emails and budget trails. But Crockett had one more move, and it wasn't for the committee. It was for the people beyond these walls, for the millions watching, for Bakersfield. She closed the final folder, sliding it aside like a chess piece no longer needed. Her eyes, sharp, unblinking, locked onto McCarthy's, who now sat motionless. His face was flushed, jaw clenched, hands clasped so tightly the whites of his knuckles showed. He hadn't spoken since his outburst, and in that silence Crockett spoke with a blade made of restraint. Her voice was soft, steady. Each word landed like a scalpel. "Mr. McCarthy," she said, her tone so even it almost felt tender, until the words themselves shattered that illusion. "If you truly represent the people of California's 20th district," she paused, just for a second, not because she needed to breathe, but because she knew the silence would cut deeper than any sentence. "Then tell us," she continued, "during all your weekends at the Ritz-Carlton Half Moon Bay, during the retreats at Rancho Palos Verdes, during the wine tastings in Napa and the luxury suites at Lakers games, was there even one night, just one, when you sat down and listened to a family from Bakersfield?" The words didn't echo. They hung, suspended in the thick, suffocating air of a hearing room that had just turned into a courtroom and then into a confession booth. McCarthy didn't move, not a blink, not a breath. Crockett leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Was there a single evening," she said again, Slower now. When you traded the comfort of a five-star resort for the reality of your own constituents' lives? Silence. The room. The entire House Oversight Committee, the aides, the gallery, the press, the watching millions, all leaned in. The camera operators, sensing the weight of the moment, zoomed tight on McCarthy's face. His skin now had the tone of cold marble. His jaw twitched slightly, but still no answer. Not even a shake of the head. The feed, being broadcast live across 3 major networks, cut to a full-frame shot of McCarthy's face. A split screen was ready with a photo of a Bakersfield neighborhood suffering water shortages and rising utility costs. A Chiron appeared. Did Kevin McCarthy forget Bakersfield? Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just let it settle. Because this wasn't about delivering a line. It was about forcing a reckoning. Not one town hall, she said quietly. Not one listening session. Not even a visit to your district's food banks, while spending over $250,000 in donor funds on luxury. The silence was now deafening. But it wasn't peace. It was paralysis. A tension so sharp it cut through stone. A Fox News reporter backstage whispered, "We're losing him." A Democratic aide muttered, "He's done." In the back row, a veteran congressional staffer with 30 years in Capitol Hill hearings whispered what no one dared say aloud. This is the kind of silence that ends careers. Jasmine leaned back, gently, the way a surgeon would after the last incision. She didn't gloat. There was no need, because everyone could see it. The rage was gone from McCarthy's eyes. The fire, the smirk, the practiced deflection, all of it had evaporated. What remained was the hollow, exhausted face of a man who realized that somewhere along the climb to power, he had stopped seeing the people at the bottom. And now, one of them had climbed up. Not to shake his hand, but to demand an answer he didn't have. Still, she waited, a beat, then another, and Kevin McCarthy said nothing. No denial, no outrage, no apology. Only the faint sound of his breath, shallow and fast, the kind of breathing that signals not fear, but exposure. The chairman didn't even try to interrupt. The ranking members remained seated. No one moved. Because everyone in the room, from the marble floor to the velvet-draped press boxes, knew something had just happened. Something final. The camera held on his face for another 5 seconds. Then 10. No edit, no escape. Just his silence, broadcast in high definition to the entire country. Then at last, Crockett broke the silence. Not with a scream, but a whisper. "Power," she said softly, "isn't about what you can buy. It's about who you serve." Then she folded her hands and let the silence finish what her words had begun. In the hearing room, silence was the verdict. But outside and in living rooms, phones, and newsrooms across the nation, the fallout detonated like a political earthquake. The story didn't end in that chamber. It ignited there. The video hit social media before the gavel even dropped. A 47-second clip, tightly edited, framed like a courtroom drama, ending on Jasmine Crockett's final devastating line, "Not me, just your budget." Within 10 minutes, the hashtag McCarthy Exposed was trending in all 50 states. Not trending, dominating. On TikTok, teens were lip-syncing her final question about the Bordeaux. On Twitter, journalists called it the most brutal dismantling of a former speaker ever broadcast live. And on YouTube, the live stream replay surged past 3 million views by dinner time. The political machine spun into overdrive. MSNBC cut in with a breaking Chiron. PAC scandal. Could McCarthy face federal probe? Rachel Maddow opened with the clip. CNN brought in 3 legal experts before 9 p.m. Even ABC News, known for its moderate tone, couldn't avoid the gravity. McCarthy's ethics crisis rocks Capitol Hill. Meanwhile, right-wing networks scrambled to reframe the narrative. Fox News initially ignored the hearing, until the virality made silence impossible. When they finally aired it, the clip had already been seen more times online than any congressional hearing in the last 5 years. Sean Hannity tried spinning it. This is just more Democrat drama. But even he sounded uncertain, his monologue delivered without the usual confidence. his graphics team visibly behind on real-time hashtags. By midnight, a dozen political analysts had appeared on air across networks to dissect the documents Crockett revealed. Federal Election Commission officials gave no comment when asked if they were reviewing the material. But that silence was enough to suggest pressure. On Reddit, threads about luxury PAC laundering overtook the front page of Our Politics. In group chats, on Discord servers, even in private Slack channels of exhausted Hill staffers, one sentence kept reappearing. She ended him with a question. But it wasn't just social media. The establishment began to shake. Axios published a midnight report citing multiple high-level Democrats and at least 2 GOP insiders who confirmed discussions about referring the matter to the Department of Justice. A leak suggested a whistleblower had already come forward to provide testimony about internal efforts to suppress PAC audit findings. Within 24 hours, Politico was reporting that House leadership, privately, had grave concerns about the optics and legality of McCarthy's expenditures. And in Bakersfield, the very district he was accused of abandoning, the impact was immediate. Local newspapers ran headlines like, 6 nights at the Ritz, 0 in Oildale? Talk radio lit up. Constituents began calling McCarthy's office, not with questions, but demands. Some wanted his resignation, others wanted refunds. On college campuses across California, student-led protest groups seized the moment. Flyers went up overnight. One showed a black and white image of McCarthy sipping wine next to a superimposed quote, "If Chevron bumps the contribution," underneath bold red letters, "Whose future did you sell?" That morning, Jasmine Crockett's office received over 70,000 new emails. Not just praise, but requests. Requests for transcripts, for the receipts, for the documentation. The public wanted more. Not just justice, but accountability, real and unfiltered. And Crockett, knowing the storm had only just begun, gave no interviews. She let the moment speak for itself. She wasn't campaigning, she was prosecuting. In Washington, aides in the Republican cloakroom panicked. Phones buzzed. GOP leadership convened an emergency late-night call to discuss containing reputational damage. But there was no containing it. The fire wasn't inside the building anymore. It was in the bloodstream of the internet, immune to spin, powered by outrage and impossible to silence. One conservative PSC privately pulled a $250,000 ad buy scheduled to support McCarthy's 2026 re-election bid. They issued no statement. They didn't need to. That same day, a group of freshman House Republicans were overheard at the Capitol steps, whispering about the Crockett effect. One turned to another and said, "She just made ethics viral." And back on Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett returned to her office as if nothing had happened. No fanfare, no grand declarations, just folders, files, and follow-up questions. Because for her, the hearing wasn't the end. It was the opening salvo. The building shook with public reaction. Outside, headlines raged and reputations burned. But inside that marble chamber, Jasmine Crockett didn't linger in the flames. She rose in silence. Not to celebrate, but to finish what she started. Jasmine didn't look back. The hearing room was still buzzing. Voices hushed, cameras packing up, journalists texting feverishly into phones that wouldn't stop vibrating. On one end, Kevin McCarthy sat deflated, eyes hollow, hands limp at his sides like a boxer who had taken too many punches and couldn't remember where the bell was. On the other, aides whispered nervously to each other, unsure whether they had just witnessed a political assassination or a divine reckoning. Chairs squeaked. Staffers gathered their belongings in silence. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz quieter, like the room itself was holding its breath. But she didn't pause to watch it unfold. Jasmine Crockett stood with the composure of someone who had walked through fire without asking for applause. Her folder, now empty, its contents scorched into national memory, rested in her left hand. Her right hand stayed by her side. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She moved with deliberate calm, her heels tapping the marble floor with the kind of clarity that made even distracted reporters look up. No applause followed her exit. Only respect. And then, just as she reached the chamber's double doors, flanked by armed Capitol security and a swarm of media held back by velvet rope, She stopped, not to pose, not to speak to a network, but to leave the country with a sentence they wouldn't forget. She turned slightly toward the press gallery, where dozens of reporters stood frozen, mics raised like offerings, questions stuck in their throats. Crockett didn't blink. "I didn't come here to shout," she said quietly, voice low but firm, amplified only by the room's silence. "I came to bring light to what's been hidden for far too long." Then she turned and walked out. No thunder, no music, no dramatic cue, just truth, left hanging in the air like incense after the fire. In that moment, something shifted. A CNN reporter dropped his pen. A Fox News producer cursed under her breath. One of the Republican aides who had once mocked her speeches stood quietly in the back, phone still recording, his finger frozen over the end video button. Because what they all knew, whether they admitted it or not, was that power had just changed hands, not by vote, not by violence, but by clarity. The cameras tried to follow her, but Crockett didn't look back. Outside the chamber, her team stood waiting, jaws clenched but eyes proud. One whispered, "You just rewrote the rules." Another handed her a phone. It had over 200 new texts. She didn't check it. Not yet. Down the hallway, chants from protesters echoed faintly through the stone. But they weren't shouting her name. They were shouting a demand. For audits, for resignations, for truth. She didn't stop to bask in it. She had heard cheers before. They weren't why she came. What stayed with her instead were the faces, the invisible ones. The single mother in Bakersfield, working 3 jobs and still rationing insulin. The veteran who couldn't afford his rent but read headlines about PAC-funded wine. The teenager who watched the hearing from a school with outdated textbooks, wondering why his future cost less than a luxury suite at Crypto.com arena. That's who she had spoken for. That's who had just won. Quietly, irrevocably. Behind her, the hearing room began to empty. McCarthy's staff tried to gather his papers, fumbling as they bumped into chairs. He remained seated, eyes unfocused, like a man who had lost a war but didn't yet know which battle ended it. One of his closest allies placed a hand on his shoulder. He shrugged it off. But Crockett never saw it. She was already gone, not to celebrate, not to collect praise, but to continue. Because for her, this was never the final act. It was only proof that light, steady, focused, unyielding, can tear through even the deepest corners of the rot. And sometimes it doesn't have to scream to be heard. It only has to speak once. She didn't walk out to applause. There were no confetti cannons, no triumphant music, just marble silence, and a nation still holding its breath. But when the echoes of that final sentence faded, something far more lasting remained. A lesson too long buried and finally unmistakably lit. The story was never just about receipts, not about wine lists, luxury resorts, or numbers typed neatly onto financial disclosures. It was about value, the kind we give to power and the kind we forget to give to people. And Jasmine Crockett, in a single hearing, reminded the country that accountability isn't an attack. It's a moral obligation. Her voice didn't shake because she wasn't there to destroy someone. She was there to restore something: fairness, integrity, vision, and perhaps most hauntingly, memory. Because America has a habit of forgetting the ones who don't shout loud enough. The school teacher with the leaking roof, the single father facing eviction, the dialysis patient counting down insurance rejections. In a system too often built on spectacle and spin, their needs get buried beneath the weight of someone else's wine-soaked packed dinner. But Crockett forced the cameras weren't in the country to look directly at them. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply refused to let silence protect power any longer. The lesson at its core wasn't about one politician's fall. It was about who we choose to protect and who we ignore when we do. It was about the fact that a man could spend $1,800 on 6 bottles of Bordeaux with political funds, while hundreds of thousands in his own district still rely on food banks that beg for funding. That when faced with a question about his people, Kevin McCarthy couldn't answer. Not because he forgot, but because he never had to remember. And that's what Jasmine exposed. Not a scandal, a disconnect, between image and impact, between authority and service, between wearing the title and doing the job. She stood before the committee not as a symbol, but as a counterweight to every unchecked dollar, to every silenced aid, to every ethical loophole written by the powerful for the powerful, and she did it without ever raising her voice. Because here's the truth, when justice is undeniable, it doesn't need to yell. It just needs to show up and refuse to blink. There was something deeply human in the way she handled it all. No victory lap, no Twitter thread of self-congratulation, just a quiet line, delivered to the nation, but meant for the unseen. I didn't come here to shout. I came to bring light to what's been hidden for too long. And with that light came reflection, not just in McCarthy's camp or among his donors, but in living rooms across the country. Teachers wrote to her, nurses, union workers, even conservatives, who may have disagreed with her policies, but couldn't deny the clarity of her purpose. Because what Crockett offered wasn't just accountability, it was dignity, reclaimed from the jaws of luxury, from the hands of those who treated public service like a personal bank account. And that's the lesson, that no one, no matter how powerful, should be too insulated to answer for the lives they were elected to serve. That justice isn't always thunderous. Sometimes it walks into a hearing room wearing heels and holding sealed documents, and it asks questions no one else had the courage to ask. By the end of the week, ethics lawyers were quoting her testimony in legal filings. Professors were dissecting her hearing strategy in civics classes. Protesters carried signs with her final line beneath black and white screen caps. But Crockett wasn't in front of cameras anymore. She was back to the work, drafting letters, requesting audits, preparing for subpoenas that might follow. Because she knew something most in power forget. Truth doesn't win in one day. It wins every time you choose to show up again, even when no one's clapping. She had faced deflection, gaslighting, public mockery, even open disrespect from her own colleagues. She had been interrupted, underestimated, and accused of turning politics into performance. But when the performance ended, she stood. And the facts did too. And that is the lesson for every voter, every donor, every cynic who stopped believing this system can still bend toward justice. It can, but only if someone is willing to drag the truth, kicking and screaming, into the light and ask it one more question. The room had emptied, the cameras dimmed, the echoes of truth still lingered in the air. But as the world turned back to its routines, one question flared behind every pair of watching eyes. Now that we know, what do we do? What Jasmine Crockett did inside that hearing room wasn't just expose a man. She exposed a system, not with rage, but with resolve. She didn't ask the country to cheer for her. She asked it to wake up. And now that the documents are public, now that the receipts have been aired, and the silence shattered, we are left standing at a crossroads. This is not where the story ends. This is where we decide if it was ever worth telling. Because make no mistake, they are counting on our silence. They always do. The powerful do not fear exposure. They fear momentum. They fear what happens when one voice like Crockett's becomes 10,000 voices, knocking on office doors, flooding congressional voicemails, turning shame into subpoenas. McCarthy sat in that chamber, cloaked in legacy and entitlement, believing that he could outlast the headlines, that the fury would peak, fade, and vanish like it always does. But this time, it doesn't have to. This time we can turn the viral into the irreversible. We can convert every share, every retweet, every stunned comment into fuel, into pressure, into policy, and yes, into consequences. Because the documents Jasmine laid down were not just financial, they were moral. They were a mirror held to a political machine that has traded principle for perks and people for power. And now that mirror is in our hands. So what do? First, we name the problem, loudly, relentlessly. In every district, in every state, we call it what it is, a betrayal. The misuse of PAC funds for personal indulgence is not a clerical error. It is not a lapse in judgment. It is a deliberate abuse of the public's trust. If our lawmakers spend more time picking resort menus than reviewing community budgets, they do not deserve the offices they hold. And we must be unafraid to say so, to their faces, in letters, on ballot initiatives, and in every public forum available. Second, we demand investigation. Public hearings are not enough. Transparency is not a gift. It is our right. We must press for full federal review of PAC-related expenditures, not just for McCarthy, but across the board. Every name, every dollar. Because sunlight must not fall only where cameras are pointed. It must shine in the corners where no one's watching, where real decisions are made. Third, we protect the truth tellers. Whistleblowers made this possible. Staffers leaked internal emails not to go viral, but to stop something wrong. Those people, often young, unpaid, scared, and targeted, need legal protections, not retaliation. We must fight for federal safeguards that make it easier, not harder, to expose corruption from within. Because the next Jasmine Crockett may not be a lawmaker. She might be a 25-year-old assistant watching her boss bury misconduct behind donor dinners. And she must know that the country will stand behind her when she steps forward. Fourth, we localize the battle. McCarthy may have been the one on trial, but this is not about one name. This is about a culture, about the way we let campaign money move unchecked, the way influence is bought in dinners instead of debates, the way we've accepted that the rich are simply better at governing, even as they forget who sent them there. We take this to city councils, school boards, state legislatures, because corruption does not trickle down. It starts at the top, but it seeps into everything. And fifth, maybe most importantly, we remember. We do not forget this next week. We do not let the next scandal bury it. We burn it into our civic muscle memory. Because history is not changed by heroes alone. It is changed by the people who refuse to look away once the lights go out. Jasmine didn't just expose spending. She exposed a pattern, a sickness, one that thrives on our exhaustion, our cynicism, our belief that nothing ever really changes. But she showed that it can. Because one woman, standing alone with nothing but documents and conviction, shifted the nation's gaze and held it. She made ethics trend. She made truth louder than money. And now we carry it forward. So here is the call. If you watched that hearing and felt your pulse race, act. If you whispered, finally someone said it, say it again, louder. If you felt anger, disbelief, or even hope, turn it into movement. Write your representatives, not once, but until they answer. Show up at town halls, bring questions, bring facts, bring fire. Start petitions for financial transparency. Ask every candidate how their PAC funds are spent. Challenge them. Follow the money. Follow the silence. Organize panels. Teach-ins. Public forums. Make this moment echo. And when election season comes, remember it all. Not just the wine. Not just the quote. Remember how it felt to watch someone put it all on the line, not for power, but for principle. Remember the fear in their eyes when they realized the public wasn't going to look away this time. Remember how close we came, not to spectacle, but to justice. This is not about turning the system upside down. It's about turning it back to what it was meant to be: transparent, accountable, human. Crockett didn't ask us to idolize her. She asked us to carry the light forward. Let's do it, and never let it go dark again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a packed New York studio, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett faced off against Fox News titan Sean Hannity over a question America's been too afraid to ask. When the media becomes the weapon, who protects the truth? Hannity tried to humiliate her, armed with decades of dominance and millions of viewers. But within 7 blistering minutes, Jasmine flipped the script with sworn testimony, leaked files, and a name he never expected to hear again. The crowd turned. The camera froze, and for the first time in 23 years, Hannity had no words. If power lies in who holds the microphone, what happens when it's ripped away? On live television. Stay with us, This is a story worth every second of your time. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom pulsed with static tension. Under the towering banner, National Media Summit, media, judge or servant, a half-moon of leather chairs awaited the night's combatants. Cameras rotated like sentries, ready to broadcast every twitch. Seated dead center was Sean Hannity, sharp in a tailored navy suit, posture loose but commanding. He wasn't just a television personality. He was the voice of conservative America, a media juggernaut who'd spent decades shaping public opinion with repetition, outrage, and ironclad certainty. He wore the smug calm of a man who believed the room answered to him. His smile wasn't polite. It was a smirk forged from decades of power without pushback. He didn't prepare, he presided. This was his arena, until the doors opened. Jasmine Crockett entered, not like a guest, but like a verdict. Dressed in black, like a silhouette of rebellion, she moved without pause or preamble. Her eyes scanned the room, not to admire, but to measure. The moderator cleared his throat, voice cracking slightly as he announced, "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising voice of reform." She nodded once, cool and razor-sharp. Across the stage, Hannity's eyes met hers, and in that instant, the air itself changed. One side smoldered with experience turned arrogance, the other with fire honed by injustice. Their silence screamed louder than any headline. They didn't blink, they didn't smile, they calculated. Hannity tapped his notes with theatrical ease. Jasmine opened a folder, thin, precise, loaded. No need for flair. She didn't come to entertain. She came to cut. This wasn't media analysis. It was war, dressed in suits and televised for America to witness. And for the first time in years, Sean Hannity might have realized he wasn't the one holding the knife. The air had barely settled from the weight of their silence when Hannity struck. Not with curiosity, not with a question, but with a performance so sharp it sliced the room in half. He leaned forward with that signature blend of arrogance and ease, his voice smooth, familiar, disarming to those who didn't know what lay beneath. "Let me begin," he said, smiling just enough to mock, "by welcoming Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a woman who, not too long ago, said Fox News should be shut down because apparently freedom of the press ends when the headlines don't flatter her." The moment landed like a slap disguised as a handshake. Chuckles rose from the audience, dry at first, then swelling into amused applause. Hannity didn't blink. He soaked in the noise like stage light. He wasn't introducing her. He was warning them, framing her not as a guest but a threat, a danger dressed in authority. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked through her, past her, as if the seat she occupied was already empty in his mind. Then came the paper. Clean, crisp, underlined quotes printed in bold. "Let's see what she's gifted us with over the years," he said, lifting the sheet with the precision of a magician about to pull a trick from thin air. Here's one. "Mainstream media reinforces systemic racism with every headline it chooses not to print." He looked up, feigned a shocked eyebrow. "Wow, that's not divisive at all." The crowd laughed. He turned to another. "If you're comfortable with the truth, you haven't met it yet." Another pause, another smirk. "And this one's my favorite," he added, holding the page higher as if offering evidence in court. "Some media platforms profit more from lies than facts because fear sells better than truth." Then with mock concern layered in sarcasm, he added, "Apparently, this is how Congresswoman Crockett defines journalism." He lowered the page slowly and stared directly into the camera, his voice growing heavier, more deliberate. "What we have here, ladies and gentlemen," he said, scanning the audience for nods, "is not a critic of media bias. This is someone who fundamentally despises the freedom of the press when it disagrees with her worldview." He let the words hang in the air like smoke from a burning flag. This isn't about accountability. This is about control, about silencing dissent, about replacing journalism with ideology. The applause that followed wasn't enthusiastic. It was triumphant. It was the sound of people being told exactly what they wanted to hear. But this wasn't debate. This was demolition. He wasn't rebutting arguments. He was disfiguring them, ripping them from context like weeds in a garden he claimed was pure. He took complex, urgent critiques, ones born from Jasmine's lived experience, navigating injustice, media exclusion, and systemic erasure, and twisted them into slogans. He reframed her as an enemy of the First Amendment, a threat to objectivity, a woman who supposedly didn't just mistrust the media, but wanted to dismantle it entirely. And all the while, Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her hands were folded calmly on the folder in her lap, her breath steady, her posture unbroken. The camera zoomed in, hoping for a flash of emotion, rage, shame, even a twitch of discomfort. But she gave them nothing, because this wasn't new. This was choreography she'd seen before. Then came the final blow. Hannity adjusted his mic, looked out into the sea of smirks, and dropped the line with surgical timing. Maybe before Congresswoman Crockett starts preaching about media integrity, she should take a moment to learn how journalism actually works. Applause erupted, full-bodied and unfiltered. It wasn't about ideas. It was about dominance, the power of familiarity, of voice, of comfort, the comfort of watching a woman of color be patronized under lights that called it discourse, the comfort of being told again that the old system was still in charge. But Jasmine sat, stone still, not frozen, coiled. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't broken. She was choosing, waiting, timing her strike not for volume, but for precision. And behind that calm was something far more dangerous than anger. Clarity, because Hannity had made one mistake. He thought she came to argue. She had come to expose. But Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't match volume with volume or sarcasm with outrage. She moved like someone who had carried this moment in her pocket for years, waiting not for permission, but for precision. Her hand moved quietly, deliberately to the microphone switch. A soft click broke the tension like a whisper before a gunshot. She didn't look to the audience, didn't glance at the moderator. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the folder before her, the same one she had kept closed while enduring the volleys of mockery and distortion. With calm fingers, she pulled a single page free, its corners already creased from use, its margin marked with highlighter and conviction. Her voice, when it came, was controlled, low enough to force people to lean in, sharp enough to slice through the fog of performance. Exhibit 247, she said, from the Dominion Voting Systems versus Fox News case, sworn deposition, Mr. Hannity, December 2020. No inflection, just truth, laid bare. I did not believe it for 1 second. She looked up, straight at him. That was your statement, under oath. The room froze. You could hear shoes shift, papers settle, even the whirring of a nearby camera motor. But Hannity didn't move. Not yet. Jasmine continued, voice still even, but gaining gravity. You said that in a closed deposition. Not on your show, not to your audience, not to the people who tuned in every night looking for clarity and instead got fed a lie, one you never even believed. Her words weren't theatrical. They were prosecutorial. She wasn't asking a question. She was building a case against him, against the brand, against the silence that protected it. Then she paused, intentionally, surgically. So tell me, Mr. Hannity, she said, each word placed like a nail driven into oak. Do you believe in freedom of speech, or do you believe in the freedom to defraud the public, so long as the ratings are good enough to justify it? No applause, no coughing, no chair creaked. The entire ballroom sat trapped in that single shattering question. Hannity shifted at last. He leaned back in his chair, arms folding across his chest in that familiar posture of manufactured composure. But something had changed. His body said control. His eyes did not. They flicked, left, right, up at the lights, searching, calculating, avoiding. The smirk remained, but its confidence had drained. In its place was the hollow performance of a man who suddenly realized the script was no longer his. Jasmine didn't press the silence. She let it speak. Because in that stillness, longer than anyone expected, louder than any applause, was the one thing Sean Hannity had never allowed into his broadcasts: accountability. And in that moment, with every eye on him and every microphone live, he had no line, no rescue, no applause cue, just the sound of his own words, read back to him by the very woman he tried to silence. The truth about the Dominion lawsuit had landed like a tremor, but Jasmine knew that beneath every crack in the surface, there was something deeper waiting to be exposed. And this time, it wasn't about ratings. It was about dignity. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move dramatically. She simply picked up a small remote resting beside her notes and pressed it. The massive LED screen behind the stage flickered, then shifted. No graphics, no headlines, just a single photo, plain, unfiltered, human. The face of Kathy Aru appeared in silence. Her expression was neutral, almost quiet, but the moment it filled the screen, the room changed. Some recognized her immediately. Others squinted, trying to remember where they'd seen that name before. And a few, those who knew exactly who she was, looked down. Jasmine didn't look back at the image. She didn't need to. Her voice, now lower but unmistakably clear, carried across the room with the weight of someone who had waited long enough. "This is Kathy Aru," she said evenly. "A journalist, a mother, a woman who once sat in the same makeup chairs, under the same studio lights, and beside the same anchor who now sits across from me." She let that sit for half a second, then quietly. She was humiliated in front of colleagues. She was silenced in court, and she was erased from this industry the moment she spoke up. The screen didn't blink. Neither did Jasmine. In her formal complaint to federal court, she continued, opening a single sheet from her folder, Ms. Areo described an incident during a live taping of Mr. Hannity's show. He held up a $100 bill on set in front of the production crew and offered it as a reward to any man in the room willing to take her out to dinner that night. Her tone was even, but the words hit like slow, deliberate strikes. Let me be clear. That wasn't a joke. That was a challenge. One wrapped in power, one designed to ridicule her, one that turned a colleague into a bet. Murmurs rippled across the room. Jasmine didn't acknowledge them. Her focus remained razor sharp. She was called too sensitive, told to move on. Lawyers called it a misunderstanding. But what do you call it when a woman is turned into a prize in her own workplace? She asked, not rhetorically, but quietly, sincerely. What do you call it when laughter becomes a weapon and no one has the courage to say it out loud? Then she turned, slowly, deliberately. For the first time, she looked directly at Sean Hannity. You thought it was funny, but I promise you, federal law does not. The screen faded to black, but the silence it left behind wasn't empty. It was judgment. And like all men who mistake applause for absolution, Hannity responded not with truth, but with volume. Sean Hannity snapped forward in his chair, fury pulsing through every word. His voice, once polished and performative, now cracked with raw indignation. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, eyes flashing toward the audience, then the cameras as if daring them to agree. "This is slander, on national television. You're making things up." His face flushed crimson, jaw clenched so tight it looked locked. He pounded his palm once against the desk, not a gesture of control, but of a man unraveling. "You're twisting words, dragging out accusations that don't belong in this forum. This isn't justice. It's a hit job." His eyes darted to the moderator, to the producers, to anyone who might jump in and stop the freefall. But no one moved. No teleprompter could save him now. What stood before the room wasn't a media legend defending truth. It was a man cornered by it. Across the table, Jasmine didn't react with triumph or glee. She didn't even blink. She turned to him slowly, deliberately, like a surgeon preparing the next incision. Her expression didn't gloat, it clarified. Her voice came low, even, the kind of calm that doesn't ask permission. "I am a lawyer, Mr. Hannity," she said, every word sharp and distinct. "And you are, as of this moment, a potential defendant." The room stilled again, not because she was loud, but because she was right. That's not my opinion. That's not theater. That's the legal distinction between someone who builds arguments and someone who breaks them under oath. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. Her authority wasn't borrowed from viewership. It came from consequence. The audience, once so quick to laugh with Hannity, now watched him with something else in their eyes. Not anger, not even pity. It was realization. That for the first time in years, the man who framed narratives was now trapped inside one. And Jasmine? She didn't come to debate. She came to remind him that the law doesn't need ratings, it only needs truth. The room was still reeling from the force of Jasmine's calm precision, but Hannity, bruised but unbowed, wasn't finished. For men like him, losing ground was never an end, only a signal to fight dirtier. He shifted forward in his chair, as if reassembling his persona brick by brick. The tremor in his pride hadn't disappeared. It had just been dressed up again in sarcasm and cynicism. "Let's not pretend this is about truth," he said, his voice regaining its manufactured steadiness. "This is theater. This is emotion masquerading as substance. What you're doing isn't journalism, Congresswoman. It's spectacle. You're not here to inform. You're here to inflame." His gaze swept across the audience, looking for the nods that once came so easily. "You're a product of a political culture obsessed with outrage. Loud voices, empty arguments, no solutions. All feeling, no facts. And the only thing more dangerous than bad policy is emotional politics parading around as justice." He leaned back slightly, as if he'd regained the upper hand, a familiar smirk threatening to return to his lips. But Jasmine didn't allow it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even shift in her seat. She waited until every syllable of his last line had settled into the silence like dust. And then she moved, not physically, but with words, clean and quiet, that cut deeper than a scream ever could. If calling out the dehumanization of women, exposing a system that protects lies, and demanding accountability is what you call emotional politics, she said, then maybe the problem isn't with my passion. Her voice was steady, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Maybe the problem is that your sense of morality never made it past the soundstage? The line didn't land like a punch. It landed like a verdict. The room froze, not just in silence, but in realization. This wasn't rebuttal. This was reflection. Because what she said wasn't just about him. It was about every camera that looked the other way, every producer who trimmed truth to fit a narrative, every audience that clapped louder for style than substance. Jasmine's voice didn't tremble. It tightened. "I wasn't sent here to make people comfortable. I wasn't elected to play nice with power. I'm here to remind people that justice doesn't arrive in a teleprompter, and truth doesn't need your permission to speak." And in that moment, the room that once belonged to Hannity no longer recognized him as its master. It had found a new voice, one that didn't perform, one that didn't retreat, one that, against every expectation, refused to fold in the face of manufactured authority. Jasmine had already shaken the room with truth, but what came next wasn't just revelation, it was confirmation. Cold, documented, and undeniable. She raised her hand, not to interrupt, not to dramatize, but to command the room's attention with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. The screen behind her flickered once more, replacing the black silence with a stark white label across the top. Deposition video. Melissa Grant, former senior segment editor, Fox News. There was no music, no graphics, just a woman in a gray blazer seated at a legal table, hands clasped, eyes steady, and a timestamp in the bottom corner. The kind of footage reserved for courtrooms, not conference stages. Jasmine didn't speak. She stepped back, allowing the video to speak for itself. Melissa Grant's voice filled the room, calm and clinical. "Yes," she said, "I was instructed directly by Mr. Hannity to assemble segments using reactions that were pre-written or recorded from unrelated events. Often we would prepare graphics and comment clips for social media fallout before the segment even aired." She blinked once, then continued, emotionless. "He said it was important to get ahead of the story, but we weren't chasing facts. We were producing emotion, anticipating public reaction, and then feeding it back to the audience like it was spontaneous." The room was frozen. No one shifted. No one coughed. The silence wasn't respectful. It was paralyzed. Melissa's voice didn't waver. It was called building the wave. He believed if we framed it strong enough, loud enough, and fast enough, the response would follow, and that response would justify the frame. It was a loop, not reporting. Reinforcement. The video cut after that, clean and simple. No outro. Jasmine stepped forward again, eyes sweeping across the audience, her tone even, her posture unshaken. That wasn't a critic. That wasn't an activist. That was one of his producers, under oath. She didn't have to raise her voice. Each word was weighed, measured, deliberate. While he accused me of bringing emotion to the table, his own newsroom was manufacturing it like a product, designing public outrage, controlling headlines before they even existed. She paused just long enough to let the truth sting. This is not freedom of speech. This is emotional laundering, wrapping fiction in just enough reality to sell it as fact. And then she said what no one else had the nerve to say in that room before her. This wasn't journalism. It was psychological manipulation in a tailored suit. And the public trusted it because they never got to see what we just did. She stepped back. The screen behind her was dark again. But now it wasn't silence that filled the space. It was consequence. Real, heavy, and finally, visible. The screen went black, but the silence it left behind wasn't relief. It was reckoning. What had started as a debate was now something else entirely. And for the first time all night, the crowd didn't know how to feel. The atmosphere in the room had changed so completely, it was almost a different space. Just 30 minutes earlier, the audience had been leaning back in their chairs, smirking, clapping along to Hannity's taunts with the smug ease of those watching a show they thought they understood. But now, they leaned forward, eyes narrowed, jaws tight. People who had laughed were no longer sure where the line between entertainment and exposure had fallen. The air, once laced with fox-flavored confidence, now hummed with discomfort. It wasn't just Jasmine's words, it was the proof, the sworn testimony, the footage, the still image of Kathy Aru's face hanging in their memory like a mirror they hadn't asked for. A woman in the third row dropped her arms from a defensive cross and rested her elbows on her knees. A man near the side stage tapped his phone screen but didn't unlock it, his thumb just hovering, as if afraid of what he'd miss. On stage, a production assistant leaned over to whisper something urgent to the floor director. The director, after a brief pause, gave a silent, universal signal. Cut the segment. Wrap it now. Move. The lights were still on. The cameras were still rolling. But behind the scenes, panic had begun to circulate like a sudden virus in a sealed room. Jasmine saw the movement, the hand gestures, the flashing red on the teleprompter indicating a countdown. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She stepped forward, and then she said it. "If you cut my microphone," she began, her voice even, clear, and louder than any control room could mute. "I still have the law. I still have the internet. I still have people watching and listening, not because they're told to, but because they choose to." The room didn't gasp. It didn't breathe. Jasmine glanced at the back cameras, not the front, not the one assigned to catch her at a flattering angle, but the one behind the audience, the one that would broadcast their reaction, not just her words. "And unlike what we've just seen tonight," she continued, "truth doesn't need a broadcast license. It doesn't need a producer's approval. It only needs one thing, the courage to say it out loud, even when every light in the room is trying to turn off." The stage manager motioned again. The screen behind her now flickered with the show's outro logo, soft music starting to fade in. Pre-programmed, pre-scheduled, pre-authorized. She took one final step closer to the edge of the stage. "And today," Jasmine said, her eyes sweeping across the crowd, "truth will not be cut off." She didn't shout it. She delivered it like a judge reading a sentence. Calm, cold, final. There was no applause. There was something better. Stillness. The kind of stillness that follows a courtroom verdict. The kind that follows the moment after a man realizes the script he's memorized his entire life no longer applies. And then all eyes turned to Hannity. He hadn't moved since the video played, since the testimony, since Jasmine turned his old set of tools, sarcasm, certainty, smirks, into useless metal at his feet. His body was stiff in his chair, his arms crossed more tightly than before. But it wasn't confidence, it was containment. His mouth parted once like he might say something, but nothing came, not even a scoff. His silence wasn't gracious, it was stunned. This was the man who never ran out of words, who could pivot through scandal, twist outrage into applause, and flip any confrontation into a ratings boost. But tonight, there was no bounce, no punchline, no pivot. Only the realization that this wasn't a TV segment. It was a moment, and it didn't belong to him. For the first time in his career, Sean Hannity was not narrating the room. He was in it. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't bow. She simply turned her microphone off herself, gently. She didn't wait to be silenced. She chose silence, because the point had already been made, and made thoroughly. Not just with emotion, but with law. Not just with anger, but with evidence. Not just with words, but with something deeper. The kind of clarity that lives longer than sound bites. She took one step back, her face composed, her spine straight, her presence unshaken. And the man who'd called her emotional, performative, irrational, sat in a silence crafted by no one but himself. He was the only one who couldn't fill the room anymore, because she already had. The stage lights dimmed, and the audience filed out in stunned silence. But what Jasmine had started inside that ballroom didn't end when the cameras cut. It had only just begun. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped off stage and into the hallway, her closing line had already begun to echo far beyond the conference walls. A producer's smartphone lit up with hundreds of notifications in a matter of seconds. The control room, once buzzing with scripted order, was now in complete chaos. Emails flooding in, phones ringing from New York to Los Angeles. Clips of her final words, "Truth doesn't need a broadcast license," began spreading across social media like wildfire. Within 15 minutes, edited videos hit Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Each cut sharper than the last, each caption bolder, angrier, louder. Jasmine destroys Hannity with facts. She spoke. He fell silent. When a lawyer becomes the truth. By the hour mark, hashtags surged into national trending territory. Crockett uncut, Fox exposed, and Truth not ratings. Overnight, her moment had become a movement. Viewers who hadn't watched the summit were now watching on loop. Teachers were showing the clip in classrooms. Activists were quoting her in live streams. Even late-night hosts, usually too timid to touch Fox News directly, aired segments with the line, "She didn't debate him. She dismantled him." But what came next pushed it into history. CNN broke the headline just past 8 a.m. the next morning. Exclusive. Kathy Arroyo speaks out, backs Jasmine Crockett's allegations against Hannity. The screen flashed with an image of Kathy, older now, sharper in the eyes, stronger in the shoulders. She wasn't behind a deposition table this time. She was on set, live, in studio. And when the anchor asked the first question, "Was what Jasmine Crockett said true?" she didn't blink. "Yes," Kathy said. "All of it." She continued, clear, measured, unapologetic. That bounty offer happened exactly as Jasmine described. The culture at Fox was toxic, and I wasn't the only one treated that way. But I was the first to speak, and I paid a price for it. Jasmine didn't just tell the truth. She told mine, and gave it a place I was never allowed to reach. The national conversation. Screens across the country froze as millions watched Kathy detail what had been buried. Emails ignored, witnesses silenced, internal HR memos rerouted to legal before they ever reached human eyes. "They didn't just try to erase me," she said. "They tried to erase what they did." By noon, Fox News was on lockdown. Inside the network's headquarters, panic had turned operational. Top executives were called into an emergency session. The meeting was off the record, windowless, and boiling with urgency. Phones were placed in Faraday pouches. Doors were secured. Someone had already printed the transcript of Kathy's interview. Someone else had red-circled key phrases, pattern of abuse, legal retaliation, deliberate silencing. A third executive pointed out what they had all begun to fear. It's not just her anymore. The entire media structure is watching. Then the inevitable question was raised, quietly, bitterly. Do we pull the plug? The room didn't answer right away. Sean Hannity's face, once the most profitable brand on their evening lineup, now sat at the center of a firestorm too big to spin. For years, they'd survived scandals with well-timed denials and shifting attention. But this was different. This wasn't just accusation. It was testimony. It was video. It was names. And worse, it was being believed. At 2:43 p.m., an internal memo was sent to the entire Fox executive team. All editorial programming connected to Hannity will be suspended pending review. Further decisions to follow. Immediate PR coordination required. Just like that, the most protected seat in cable news was no longer guaranteed. Outside, reporters crowded the front doors. Cameras clicked with every employee exiting the building. Protesters had begun gathering, some with signs quoting Jasmine word for word. "If you cut my mic, I still have the law." Others carried Kathy's face, printed in black and white above the words, "Believe her." But amid the storm, Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't tweet. She didn't do interviews. She didn't post victory videos or dance to trending audios. She disappeared from public view for 24 hours. Because for Jasmine, this wasn't about spectacle. It was about consequence. The kind of consequence women like Kathy had never been granted. The kind that didn't end with applause, but with accountability. She knew the system wouldn't fall overnight, but for the first time, it had blinked. And she wasn't done. Not even close. But the shockwaves from Jasmine's confrontation didn't stop at headlines or hashtags. They cracked something deeper, something institutional. In newsrooms from Manhattan to Milwaukee, and in classrooms where tomorrow's journalists were still learning the ethics they'd soon have to abandon, something shifted. And for the first time in years, truth didn't feel like a slogan. It felt like a demand. Within 48 hours of the summit, dozens of resignation letters started appearing across social media. At first, they were brushed off by executives as isolated cases of professional immaturity. But by the third day, entire digital teams had walked out of 2 regional affiliates. A viral tweet from a 23-year-old producer at a mid-tier outlet read, "I joined journalism to fight for truth, not ratings." Jasmine reminded me what that looks like. Another post on Substack, written by a veteran who had covered 3 administrations, was more brutal. If my silence gave power to someone like Hannity, then Jasmine Crockett didn't just call him out, she called me out too. Each post struck like a drumbeat in a swelling rebellion, louder with every hour. By the weekend, Columbia Journalism School announced a full-day emergency colloquium. The banner on its official invite, now plastered across academic networks, bore one sentence in stark, block serif font. Who controls the narrative and who controls them? The event didn't feel academic. It felt like a tribunal. Inside Pulitzer Hall, cameras lined the walls. Ivy League deans sat shoulder to shoulder with undergraduates in hoodies. Even tenured professors looked uneasy, not because they feared disagreement, but because they knew they were no longer safe behind abstraction. The moderator opened not with a quote from Walter Cronkite or Murrow, but with a clip, unedited, of Jasmine's now infamous line. "Do you believe in freedom of speech, or just freedom to lie for ratings?" The room held its breath. When the lights came back on, no one moved for a full 5 seconds. A student from Yale stood up, voice steady. "We've spent years dissecting fake news in theory, but we just watched a sitting congresswoman cut through it in real time. That wasn't politics. That was journalism." A faculty member from NYU added quietly, "It used to be said that the media shapes reality. What happens when the truth shapes the media?" No one laughed. No one dismissed it. For the next 5 hours, testimonies poured in. A former CNN field producer recalled being told to wait for the right spin before airing footage. An ex-social editor from a major network described internal Slack channels designed to heat up outrage before primetime. But most striking were the voices of the students who had dreamed of reporting from war zones, covering crises and exposing fraud, now questioning whether the institutions they aspired to join still valued any of it. Back in Washington, Jasmine sat in her modest office, phone off, laptop closed, simply breathing in the silence that follows a storm. Her assistant entered quietly, carrying a thick bundle of printed letters and emails. Jasmine didn't reach for them at first. She just stared at the weight of them, like they carried something she wasn't yet ready to feel. Then she took one from the middle, a single handwritten line. "You didn't just win an argument, you changed the rules of the game. The next was from a journalism major in Texas. Every professor here tells us to stay neutral, but you showed us that truth is not neutral, and we don't have to be either. One envelope, unusually thick, had a note clipped to the front, shared by 42 student editors across the country. Inside was a signed petition nominating Jasmine for the Independent Media Ethics Award, an honor that had, until then, only gone to working journalists. The nomination letter read, "She is not a reporter, but she held the most powerful reporter in America to account, not with spin, with fact, not with fury, with truth, and she did it on his turf." Jasmine didn't cry. She rarely did. But she folded that letter with care, pressed it flat, and slid it between the pages of a worn legal binder labeled Truth and Reform. Then, for the first time in a long time, she leaned back in her chair, not with exhaustion, but with quiet purpose. Outside her door, the world was still spinning. Networks were still strategizing. Executives were still meeting behind closed doors. But somewhere, a freshman in Missouri turned down an internship at a Fox affiliate. Somewhere, a junior in New Jersey rewrote their senior thesis to include Jasmine's speech as a case study in journalistic integrity. Somewhere, a student newspaper replaced a scheduled op-ed with an editorial titled, "When Truth Walked in Wearing Black." This wasn't just fallout, it was formation. And in those rare, quiet moments when Jasmine sat alone, no cameras, no microphones, no need to perform, she knew something irreversible had happened. Not because she had destroyed a man's argument, but because she had reminded a generation what it looks like to fight back with facts, to cut through power not with volume, but with precision. For years, media had taught America how to forget. That night, Jasmine taught them how to remember, and the truth at last was no longer scared to speak. And while institutions hesitated, the independent voices rose. Like embers catching wind, the backlash ignited not through official channels, but through raw, unfiltered momentum. It began with a tweet from an anonymous journalist, captioned only, "What if we've been complicit?" Within hours, a private Slack group of investigative reporters, many of whom had long felt handcuffed by corporate media contracts, turned into a hive of quiet rebellion. They didn't wait for permission. They began digging. It wasn't a formal investigation, no press conference, no banner headline. Just a spreadsheet, a shared drive, and the grit of those who still believed journalism was supposed to serve the public, not manufacture its beliefs. They called it Project Frequency. Its mission was clear: track every time Sean Hannity had broadcast misinformation and document the aftermath. Within 3 days, the file held over 200 entries, complete with dates, video links, transcripts, and, more hauntingly, the real-world consequences that followed each lie. One entry showed a segment falsely linking a Muslim city council candidate to terrorist sympathies, airing just 72 hours before the man's family received death threats and had to flee their home. Another entry revealed a debunked story accusing a high school teacher of indoctrinating students with critical race theory. The segment ran in prime time. The teacher was doxxed the next morning. She lost her job. She moved to another state. No correction ever aired. But what chilled the team most weren't just the lies. It was the quiet trail of muted apologies that came after. They found buried legal filings, non-disclosure settlements inked in silence, apologies signed behind closed doors, reputations repaired with money but never with airtime. One memo uncovered in a civil complaint simply read, "Client requests on-air apology." Fox declined, offered private letter instead. They contacted the victims, teachers, pastors, election workers, parents of trans kids, falsely accused of grooming, of fraud, of anti-Americanism, people who'd never been famous until they became punching bags for a narrative. One by one, they agreed to speak, not for justice, but for reckoning. "We weren't destroyed by fact," one woman said. "We were erased by fiction." The team created an interactive archive, a single portal where anyone could search Hannity's broadcast by date, topic, and alleged misinformation. Within a week, it was trending on Reddit. Within 2, it crashed from traffic overload. The public wasn't just curious. They were starving for receipts, for evidence, for truth reclaimed from memory. And then came the hardest part, the internal whistleblowers. A former segment producer, using a voice modulator, shared how emotional velocity was prioritized over factual precision. They told us we needed three things per story: a villain, a symbol, and a trigger. The truth was optional. The formula was sacred. Another editor admitted they had been instructed to reframe raw footage to stoke anger, even if it meant removing context. "We didn't lie," he said. "We just told the truth sideways, which sometimes is worse." They compiled all of it, transcripts, emails, internal directives, into a single encrypted report called the Unspoken Broadcast. It didn't accuse Hannity of making mistakes. It accused him of perfecting them. Newsweek ran an op-ed, "America's Most Trusted Liar?" The Atlantic followed, "The Ratings That Cost Us Reality." And on an independent podcast ranked #1 on Spotify that week, a former Fox contributor dropped the line that pierced the silence. Hannity didn't just poison the well, he made us thirsty for it. Across the country, civic groups demanded congressional hearings. Journalism schools revised curriculum. Media watchdogs expanded their archives. But in living rooms and kitchen tables, where most of Hannity's influence had festered, something more subtle happened. Viewers didn't just stop watching, they started questioning. They Googled, they rewatched, they asked their parents, "Did he ever tell you the whole story?" The scandal wasn't in the shouting, it was in the silence, in the corrections that never aired, in the faces never shown again after being used as punchlines, in the inboxes of producers who begged to issue retractions but were told, "We don't do U-turns, we double down." For Jasmine Crockett, the fallout wasn't about vindication, it was about validation. She hadn't just cut through a man, she had cut through an ecosystem, and now that ecosystem was bleeding. Somewhere in a small studio apartment in Des Moines, a journalism student stayed up till 3 a.m., compiling a personal database of media lies, not for class but for conscience. Somewhere in Georgia, a former veteran-turned-truck driver logged into the Project Frequency site, found a segment that once maligned him and whispered, "I knew it." And in every corner of the country, those who had been labeled overreacting, too sensitive, or emotional began to feel something rare, seen. Not because Hannity was silent, but because they were no longer silent. It wasn't justice, but it was the beginning of something that looked like it. And this time, no one could cut to commercial. The walls of legacy media were crumbling, but Jasmine wasn't waiting for the dust to settle. As the echo of her confrontation with Hannity still ricocheted across the country, and major outlets debated whether to cover it or downplay it, she made a move they didn't expect. She didn't go back on air. She didn't accept any invitation from the same networks that once muted stories like hers. She didn't seek airtime. She seized it. At precisely 7 p.m. Eastern, Jasmine Crockett went live. Not on a studio set, but from her modest office lined with legal books and a glowing Black Lives Matter banner behind her desk. No makeup crew, no teleprompter, no executive producer whispering in her ear, just her voice, her truth, and a blinking red dot. And unlike any network she'd ever been on, she wasn't alone. The screen split within minutes, one face, then another, then another. They weren't politicians. They weren't celebrities. They were the collateral damage Hannity had left behind. She began with a breath, long, steady, deliberate. "Tonight," she said, "we're not responding to lies. We're reclaiming what those lies cost." The first speaker was a mother from Arizona, Emma Rivas. 2 years ago, Hannity ran a segment suggesting she helped traffic illegal immigrants across the border. The reality? She ran a volunteer aid station handing out bottled water to migrants abandoned by smugglers in the desert. After the segment aired, someone firebombed her supply shed. The police found her dog poisoned. Her kids still get called slurs at school. "I wrote letters to Fox," Emma said, voice shaking. "I asked them to correct it. All I got was silence." Next came Darius Lane, a Navy veteran who had spoken out at a city council meeting in Ohio about police reform. Hannity's show labeled him a BLM extremist and accused him of disrespecting American values. Darius lost his job. His VA counselor was warned he was unstable, and his younger brother, who hadn't even been involved, was jumped outside a grocery store. Freedom of speech? Darius asked the camera. That man weaponized it, against me, against truth. Jasmine let the silence hang. Her face didn't flinch. She wasn't just hosting, she was witnessing. The pain, the patterns, the predictable playbook of distortion and denial. It was all being laid bare not in headlines, but in the trembling voices of those who'd survived them. A young woman named Camille joined next. She had once worked as an intern for a local Democratic campaign in Florida. Her picture was pulled off a public Instagram post and used in a story accusing the campaign of hiring radicalized youth. Hannity's segment blurred nothing. Her name was said aloud. Online, the backlash came fast. Death threats, doxing, her family forced to move. She never went into politics again. He didn't just steal my safety, she said. He stole the future I thought I was building. The live stream grew. By the hour mark, over 2 million viewers had tuned in. Thousands more flooded the comments with stories of their own. Grandfathers misquoted, teachers misrepresented, neighbors maligned by headlines they never got to correct. And through it all, Jasmine didn't narrate. She curated. She passed the mic, not for sound bites, but for justice. Then came a shift. Jasmine turned toward the camera, gaze direct and unwavering. Let's be clear, she said, her voice low and firm. This isn't about cancel culture. It's about consequence. For too long, media giants have played God with the reputations of real people. They twist narratives for profit and walk away while lives fall apart. That ends tonight. She leaned forward slightly, her hand gesturing to her laptop. These stories you've just heard, they weren't mistakes. They were strategy. Her voice darkened. If you're asking why Hannity never corrected the record, you're asking the wrong question. Ask instead why he needed the lie more than he ever needed the truth. Behind her, the screen began rolling clips, side-by-side comparisons. Hannity's segments aired in full. Fiery headlines, ominous music, fast-cutting montages designed to inflame. Next to them, Jasmine showed raw footage, the actual town halls, full speeches, longer quotes from people he had vilified. The contrast was staggering. In one, a school board member was painted as anti-American. In reality, he was reading a Frederick Douglass passage on the meaning of true liberty. Another was a nurse accused of spreading vaccine hysteria. Her real words were about insufficient staffing in rural hospitals. The chat exploded. The truth wasn't just shocking, it was familiar. People didn't just feel manipulated, they felt betrayed. As the live stream surged past 3 million live viewers, Jasmine paused. Then with a quiet finality, she said, Fox won't air these voices, but I will, because truth doesn't expire when it's inconvenient. Then as if on cue, a new guest joined, Kathy Aru herself, her hair now streaked with silver, her face weary but resolute. She recounted in measured detail how Hannity had once offered $100 to any male staffer who'd take her on a date. A joke, he claimed, but to her it was public humiliation. She spoke not for revenge, but for record. He built a kingdom where mockery was currency, she said, where the value of a woman could be traded for a punchline. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't dramatize. She let Kathy speak uninterrupted for 10 full minutes. The power wasn't in rebuttal, it was in listening. When Kathy finished, Jasmine turned once more to the audience, now topping 5 million. What you've heard tonight isn't political, it's personal. The damage done by deception is not theoretical, it's visible, it's measurable, and it's no longer invisible. She clicked a key on her laptop. A website link appeared on the screen, www.mediavictimregistry.org. This is a resource, and she said, for every name erased, every apology denied, every correction that never aired. Tonight we begin the archive that Fox News never wanted to exist. The chat slowed for a moment, as if even the viewers needed to take a breath. Then it roared back to life. Donations flooding in, emails offering testimony, volunteers pledging to catalog clips, timestamps, and fact checks. What began as a solo live stream had become a movement, not led by slogans, but by scars. By the second hour, the broadcast had broken records, surpassing even presidential debate numbers on several platforms. Not because of controversy, but because for once, victims weren't framed. They were centered. Jasmine leaned back in her chair for the first time, exhaling. "I didn't come here to win a debate," she said softly. "I came to make sure no one gets buried under another broadcast again." And as the live stream continued, an endless scroll of testimony, footage, and digital solidarity, one thing became painfully, unmistakably clear. Silence had finally met its match. It came not with thunder, but with a whisper. At exactly 8:03 a.m. East Coast time, a Fox News press release, plain, clinical, and dispassionate, landed in journalists' inboxes across the country. It was only 4 paragraphs long. The headline, "Sean Hannity to take indefinite leave to focus on personal well-being." No fanfare, no farewell, no farewell monologue filled with flag-waving, Constitution-quoting pride. Just silence packaged in corporate speak. For a man who had spent over 2 decades commanding primetime America like a general at war, it was the strangest of exits. Sean Hannity, the juggernaut of right-wing media, the man whose voice once defined nightly political discourse, had gone quiet, and not even his most devout followers could ignore the strange timing. Just days earlier, Jasmine Crockett had stood on a national stage and carved through his mythos like a scalpel through silk. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was consequence. Inside the Fox News headquarters, tension turned to containment. His name was scrubbed from the week's on-air lineup before noon. The promotional banners on their website were quietly replaced. The bright red Hannity block-letter marquee that had once lit up the Manhattan skyline like a symbol of ideological supremacy, gone. Not covered, removed. Executives gave no public reasoning, but they didn't need to. America had already seen what Jasmine showed them. A man who didn't just lose an argument, he lost his mask. In conservative circles, there was confusion first, then defiance. Exhaustion was the official excuse. But exhaustion doesn't come overnight. Exhaustion doesn't erase a career's worth of content from rerun slots. Exhaustion doesn't trigger legal consultants to begin scrubbing archives. What the public witnessed wasn't burnout. It was the first visible fracture in a machine that had long operated without brakes, fueled by outrage, repetition, and unchecked influence. Back-channel whispers painted a more damning portrait. Staffers reported that Hannity hadn't set foot in his usual studio in days. Some claimed his office door remained locked from the inside. Others suggested he had tried to record a defiant message, but it was halted by legal advisors worried it could be used as evidence. It wasn't just his show that was being paused. It was his legacy, now stuck in limbo, suspended by legal threats and public scrutiny. For the first time, silence felt louder than his voice. News outlets on both sides of the aisle began dissecting his downfall. MSNBC ran hour-long specials analyzing the cultural shift, how one woman, armed with facts, law, and lived experience, dismantled decades of narrative manipulation. CNN's Don Lemon delivered a chilling monologue. The fall of Hannity isn't just about one man. It's about what happens when the megaphone becomes more important than the message. Even the usually conservative-leaning Wall Street Journal asked a searing question in its Sunday op-ed. Was Sean Hannity ever a journalist or just the loudest actor in America's longest-running political theater? But perhaps most damning of all were the reactions from inside his own ideological ranks. Viewers who once echoed his every word began questioning the script. Former colleagues went curiously quiet. Some issued half-hearted defenses on Twitter, but the fire was gone. Hannity's defenders looked like soldiers who had just realized they might have followed the wrong general into battle. The once blazing army of loyalists now resembled a retreating crowd, confused and leaderless. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't post celebratory tweets or call press conferences. She stayed absent from television. Instead, her silence became its own form of pressure, letting the weight of truth sit with the country without interruption. She had said what needed to be said. The truth had been televised. Now the echoes did the work. And those echoes grew louder. Clips of her confrontation replayed endlessly online, each rewatch surfacing a new detail. A glance, A pause, a turn of phrase that hit harder with context. Memes flooded social media. The quote, "I'm a lawyer, you're a potential defendant," appeared on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and protest signs. Students in journalism schools began quoting her lines in class debates. On campuses across the country, her words replaced textbook passages. And in this new charged atmosphere, Hannity's absence didn't inspire sympathy. It inspired questions. What else had been hidden? How many others had been silenced? How long had America mistaken charisma for credibility? Inside Fox, internal communications took on a new tone. Producers who once worked tirelessly to construct nightly echo chambers now found themselves asking legal teams what segments could be re-aired without triggering liability. Editors dug through archives, identifying episodes where information might have crossed into provable misinformation. HR initiated a review of every harassment claim made in the past 15 years, including the Kathy Aryu incident, now front and center thanks to Jasmine's laser-point accuracy. And still, Hannity stayed gone. Rumors swirled that he had fled to Florida, staying at a private compound surrounded by family and attorneys. One former Fox staffer anonymously reported, "He's not resting, he's unraveling." Another insider confirmed that several of Hannity's sponsors had pulled contracts overnight, demanding brand distance until investigations wrapped. The man who once boasted of being unbreakable had simply vanished, and yet his absence only amplified Jasmine's presence. It wasn't just a television moment anymore. It was a shift. A woman of color standing alone on a stage designed to humiliate her had turned the tables so completely that the man holding the cards left the game altogether. And America watched it happen in real time. In Washington, members of Congress, quietly at first, began to reference the Hannity reckoning in hallway conversations. Lawmakers debated calling for hearings on media ethics, misinformation, and corporate broadcasting accountability. Lobbyists for media reform saw a sudden boost in funding. Activist groups printed her face next to the phrase, "Not afraid of your cameras, only afraid of silence." But no matter how many headlines it generated, one image remained seared in the public's mind. The look on Hannity's face the moment Jasmine asked if he believed in freedom of speech or freedom to deceive. He had no answer then, and in the days since, none had arrived. So the screen stayed dark. The show didn't air. Hannity's chair sat empty, and for the first time in years, the primetime hour that once reverberated with outrage fell silent. But it wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence after an explosion. When the dust settles, the ears ring, and the world waits to see what's left standing. And what remained was not Hannity. It was Jasmine, still standing, still watching, still waiting. The storm had passed. The headlines had cooled. The camera crews had rolled back their cords and folded their tripods. Fox News was silent. Hannity's name had been wiped from prime time, like chalk washed away by rain. And across the country, a new question echoed. Not just what happened, but what changed. The answer stood quiet in a chair across from Anderson Cooper on a late-night CNN special. There were no roaring audiences, no flashing headlines on the lower third of the screen. Just one camera, one host, and Jasmine Crockett sitting with her hands calmly folded in her lap, eyes locked on the lens. Not for attention, but for clarity. The air around her was unusually still, like the moment before a judge hands down a verdict. Anderson had asked her the question everyone else was too afraid to ask bluntly. "Do you feel vindicated?" She didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't lean forward or back. She just held her breath for half a second, then gave the country its answer. "We don't need to destroy anyone to demand justice," she said slowly, her voice like carved glass, sharp, clear, deliberate. "We only need to cut the microphone of the man screaming with borrowed sound." The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Anderson didn't speak. The producers didn't cue a follow-up. The studio didn't fade to commercial. The line just lingered. It wasn't just a mic drop. It was a nail in a coffin built out of decades of misinformation, intimidation, and performance masquerading as patriotism. That one sentence, less than 20 words, tore through the country's collective spine. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even reacting. She was doing what she'd done from the very beginning, choosing precision over volume. It was a lesson wrapped in restraint, and the weight of that choice didn't go unnoticed. Backstage, a junior CNN staffer stood frozen at the monitor. She wasn't part of the segment. She wasn't even assigned to that floor. But when Jasmine spoke, she found herself transfixed. She would later write a blog post titled, "When Justice Whispered Back," calling that moment the most powerful silence she'd ever witnessed on live TV. It went viral within the hour. And it wasn't just the staffer. All across the country, people paused mid-sentence, mid-scroll, mid-thought, just to replay that one line. On TikTok, creators stitched Jasmine's sentence over footage of civil rights marches, courtrooms, and flashing headlines about Hannity's sudden fall from grace. On Twitter, activists and journalists turned it into a banner. Borrowed microphones have echoes. Truth has roots. But in that studio, Jasmine didn't react to any of that, because she wasn't speaking for a meme. She was speaking for the invisible. The women too afraid to report harassment because the newsroom protected its stars. The men who had been slandered in primetime and never received an apology, only silence. The interns who brought coffee to anchors spreading propaganda. The viewers who never knew they were being taught to distrust each other under the guise of patriotism. Anderson eventually found words again. "Some people say this moment was your triumph," he offered carefully, still shaken. "Would you call it that?" Jasmine shook her head once. "This isn't a moment, it's a wound." Her voice never rose. "And I didn't win anything. The truth just finally stopped being afraid." Behind the scenes, producers scrambled to reroute the program's timeline. The interview had gone off script, far beyond their time cues. But no one dared cut it short. This wasn't content. This was reckoning. And it kept unfolding with every breath Jasmine took. She talked not about herself, but about systems. About silence as a currency in media circles. About careers built not on truth, but on the tolerance of distortion. About the way America treats microphones like badges instead of responsibilities. She spoke not like a victor, but like a surgeon cutting out a tumor, methodical, unsentimental, focused on what must be removed for the body to live. Then she said nothing more. She stood quietly, shook Anderson's hand, and left the studio through a side hallway with no security detail, no press trail, no entourage. Just her phone, and the weight of a nation that had suddenly remembered the difference between freedom of the press and the freedom to manipulate. Across the country, TV pundits scrambled to spin the moment. Some on the far right called her words a veiled threat to free speech. Others, trying to be clever, labeled her the woke whisperer. But those arguments didn't land, not this time. Because Jasmine hadn't shouted, she hadn't canceled, she hadn't demanded vengeance. She had only pulled the curtain back on a system that had protected one voice above all others for too long, and asked the simplest question of all: who gave him the microphone? That question echoed longer than anything Hannity had ever screamed in his career. It made its way into classrooms, into courtrooms, into corporate media boardrooms where new anchors now practice not just what to say, but when to shut up. A journalism professor at New York University printed Jasmine's quote across the top of a syllabus for his ethics class. "This," he told his students, "is the line between commentary and corruption." Meanwhile, Jasmine refused all follow-up interviews. She declined offers from major networks. She rejected book deals and documentary pitches. Her office released a simple statement the next day: "The Congresswoman believes the truth doesn't need a sequel. It needs enforcement." That alone sent chills through newsrooms everywhere. Because in an era where everyone chased the next headline, the next clip, the next applause, Jasmine Crockett walked away without asking for applause. And in doing so, she made every standing ovation look like noise. Even her critics struggled to regain footing. Because how do you attack someone who doesn't claim victory? How do you discredit someone who didn't need to win, only to expose? How do you shout down a woman who already proved silence, when used precisely, can shake the walls of a nation louder than any rant? In private texts, rival pundits admitted to each other, she didn't just win, she rewrote the rules. And yet Jasmine, in her final words, hadn't even asked for new rules. She had simply reminded the country what it means to speak without a borrowed microphone, to speak from truth, to speak with earned volume, not inherited power. And that, in the end, was the line that stayed with America long after the cameras turned off. We only need to cut the microphone of the man screaming with borrowed sound. No threats, no gloating, just the quiet dismantling of a legacy built on noise. And in that quiet, something sacred was reborn. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.